Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Israel vows to continue its military bombardment of Hezbollah targets in Lebanon indefinitely. Discussions on the U.S.-led ceasefire proposal are continuing. China's benchmark stock index set for its biggest weekly gain since 2008 as officials pledge to increase fiscal support and stabilize the property sector. Plus, we hear from Angola's foreign minister, who sees a boost to business sentiment coming from President Biden's upcoming visit to the southern African nation. Well, it has just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates, 5 a.m. in the UK. I'm Jumana Versace in London for the last time this week. Let's get you straight to these markets because once more we saw a solid day of green across the board. Wall Street, yet another record high, building on from solid gains throughout the week as a whole. The S&P ending up more than 0.4% higher yesterday. Nasdaq up 0.6% higher. Today, futures not doing a lot, but once again, a very strong session for these Asian equities. The CSI index in China is on track for its best week in 10 years. So all of this in reaction to some of these China stimulus measures that were put through this week, both on the monetary policy front, but also fiscally as well. So a big story that has come out of China. The USD trading slightly firmer this morning, so bucking the recent weakness trend. So we're about 0.1% firmer. Of course, a lot of eyes still on the strength in the pound and the euro. We'll be talking more about the FX market later shortly with Jane Foley from Rabobank. And then Brent continues to slip. A lot of downward pressure in the last couple of days. Yesterday, oil complex was down almost 4%, so 5% weaker the last couple of sessions on expectations of resumption of supply, both out of Libya and also a story doing the rounds in the FT suggesting that Saudi Arabia are open to further output as well. So let's push on and talk about the latest news coming out of the region. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed his military will continue its indefinite bombardment of what he says are Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Netanyahu says the attacks will carry on until all Israel's objectives have been achieved. That's after the US, the EU and major Arab nations proposed a 3-week pause in fighting to give diplomatic talks a chance. The White House defended the ceasefire proposal, saying the US had every reason to believe the Israeli government was willing to consider a halt in fighting across the Lebanon border.
That statement we worked on last night wasn't just drawn up in a vacuum. It was done after careful consultation, not only with the countries that signed on to it, but Israel itself. And we had every reason to believe that in the drafting of it and in the delivery of it, that the Israelis were fully informed and fully aware of every word in it.
Now, Benjamin Netanyahu is set to address the UN General Assembly later today, where he is widely expected to defend his military campaign in Lebanon and Gaza. Meanwhile, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas called for an immediate withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza during his United Nations address.
Israel has reoccupied the Gaza Strip in its entirety, and it has destroyed it almost entirely. This madness cannot continue. We condemn this aggression, and we demand that it stops immediately.
The history in the region also tells us that once you embark on a war footing, events take a certain hold on you, and it is not easy to disengage. So it's extremely important that the deal for a ceasefire works.
So for more on this, Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa and Russia, Stuart Livingston-Wallace, joins me now. Stuart, how likely was it that this ceasefire was going to be accepted in the first place? I mean, is there still hope that a ceasefire can be agreed to? And in this case, we're only talking about Israel and Lebanon.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I would say as of today, it doesn't look very likely. But of course, as you know, things can change rather rapidly. To some extent, I think it will depend on what Hezbollah's reaction is here. So in other words, if it continues to fire across the border, if it if it continues to be present in that, the far south of Lebanon, then Israel may feel obliged just to keep going. And as the Prime Minister said yesterday, they will keep going until they've hit all their objectives. And their objectives largely is to try and demilitarize the south of Lebanon. It's supposed to remove the threat of rockets coming across, and ultimately, for the domestic audience, it's about moving those 65,000 people back up into northern Israel. So I think until they're in a position where they feel they can do that and those people are then safe, this will continue. They clearly have overwhelming superiority.
Yeah, Stuart, one of the questions people always ask me, or at least are discussing, is where Iran stands in all of this. Hezbollah, obviously, Iran-backed in terms of military financing support, training, but they've sort of been a bit distant from what has been happening in Lebanon. We heard from the president at the UN General Assembly earlier this week. What do you think Iran's calculus is right now?
I think at the moment they're looking at the situation and they're taking one big factor into account, which is that every time we get an escalation, the US tends to move more firepower into the region. And again, when you think about what's happened inside Iran quite recently, that is with the assassination of Haniyeh, the Hamas, one of the Hamas leaders, and then when you look at the infiltration of the supply chains amongst Hezbollah, I think there has to be a certain nervousness within Iran about, A, what exactly are their capabilities, what's being compromised, and if they do react, what is the likely response from the US, and ultimately, is that to the advantage of Iran? So if you think back to April, where they sent this, something like 300 drones and missiles across, I think just about every single one was taken out. So that was a carefully coordinated attack, but it failed. And again, thinking about self-preservation here, is it necessarily in the interest of Iran right now to weigh in on this particular conflict? And it's very hard to see what exactly the options are for Iran in the short term.
Yeah, I think that the key description here is self-preservation, and that's it seems to be Iran's ostensible goal here. Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa and Russia, Stuart Livingston-Wallace, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's continue the conversation with Yezid Sayigh, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Good morning to you, sir. Thanks very much for joining our show today. Do you think this ceasefire proposal was one that was had any chance of getting passed by either side, by both Israel and Hezbollah?
I think not. Not because it wasn't sensible. And what we're hearing from the Biden administration is that they had actually gone over it word for word with Israeli officials, and they understood that they had Israeli agreement, and so they seem to have been, taken aback by the Israeli reaction. My feeling is that neither Israel nor Hezbollah have an immediate interest in ceasing fire, at least not without the other also ceasing fire. For Israel, I think Netanyahu's personal political interest is to maintain conflict because that secures his domestic position and gives him leverage over the United States administration. From Hezbollah's side, I think that they're still reluctant to accept the kinds of terms that Israel wants in order to cease fire.
So if we go back to the new war objective that the Israeli government introduced last week, and that was to reclaim security back close to their northern border to allow residents of Israel to move back home. What they want to do is to ensure that Hezbollah are sufficiently, their capabilities sufficiently diminished so that the threat of rockets getting fired into northern Israel is diminished, right? And I wonder to what extent that has happened over the course of the last week with the critical injuries that has occurred with some of their senior operatives in the telecommunications explosions last week, with the taking out of some senior military commanders. You could say that Hezbollah has sustained some serious blows. But to what end and to what extent do you think this is going to be sufficient enough for Israel to say, we have done enough now and we think that our border is going to be safe?
Well, first of all, I think that looking at Israeli policy, politics drives the agenda. And therefore, both domestic politics and geopolitics drive this agenda on the Israeli side. In other words, there aren't clear military answers to your question. We've seen in Gaza where the Israeli army has absolute dominance and has basically occupied pretty much the entirety of the Gaza Strip, and it still faces resistance and is unable to completely dominate the situation. It doesn't have the chance to do that in Lebanon. The key to what you might call victory for Israel in the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon would be to land blows on Hezbollah that affect its political will to fight. And, it looked last week, with the Pagers attack and subsequent assassinations or target killings of senior commanders, that Israel might actually get Hezbollah to feel that pursuing the fight is just too high a risk and that they prefer to accept terms such as withdrawing from the southern border. But there's no military measure for that. This is about political will. And if Hezbollah decides to keep fighting back, it will replenish, it will rebuild. And in that sense, Israel can't achieve kind of dominance.
Yeah. To what extent do you think Gaza and Lebanon now have become linked to each other?
Well, they've been linked from day one as far as Hezbollah is concerned, and this whole conflict on the northern border of Israel with Hezbollah is entirely about the linkage that Hezbollah said, we are not going to let you bomb Gaza to smithereens without showing some sort of support and solidarity for the Palestinians. And finally, Israel is moving more decisively to bring that northern conflict to a close. And I think the primary Israeli interest really is not returning 60,000 people to their homes in northern Israel, because they've had a whole year in which they could have done that, or should have done that, if you like. And so what else is determining the timing? I think from the Israeli government's perspective, delinking, forcing Hezbollah to disconnect from Gaza, in other words, say, we will cease fire regardless of what's happening in Gaza. This is probably the primary goal. And so far, Hezbollah is unwilling to give that up. And therefore, I think Israel is stuck, and it's put itself partly in a position where it's talking about total victory, which is a meaningless term in this context. And whether it can achieve even a partial victory, I think, is also doubtful.
Yeah. Yezid, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today on the show. Yezid Sayigh, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Thank you. Well, coming up, we discuss global risk-on sentiments in markets as we count down to the PCE data out of the U.S. with Rabobank's Jane Foley. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Versace in London. It's risk-on in markets, with Asian stocks extending a rally after China's latest stimulus measures and upbeat U.S. momentum. U.S. futures show some selling pressure after the S&P 500 hit a fresh record for the year. We get the Fed's preferred inflation gauge later today, and Bloomberg Economics forecasts PCE inflation for August to reflect a cooling economy. The expectation is that it will come in at 2.3% year-on-year in August, down from 2.5% in July. Let's bring in Jane Foley, head of FX strategy at Rabobank. Jane, how closely are you watching the inflation data or the PCE numbers that have come out later today, given that the Fed have told us that they're placing slightly more weight these days on the employment side of things?
Well, I mean, that's exactly the fact, because, yes, we're all watching this number, but perhaps not quite so closely as we were even a month or two ago. Now, what's quite interesting about this release, though, is that the headline is forecast to come down a little bit, but the core is expected by the consensus to tick up, a slight amount. But I really do think that unless there is a significant miss relative to market expectations for this number, that it probably won't significantly alter market expectations about Fed easing going forward. I think that the Fed has told us that it is more concerned perhaps about the labour side of its mandate, and therefore the market's going to be more concerned about the labour side. So I think the focus really will be more on the payrolls data at the start of October rather than this release today.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you think about the USD, do you think the currency is adequately or sufficiently pricing in what the markets are pricing in terms of interest rate cuts, almost 200 basis points by the end of next year?
Well, the market has had a tendency in the last couple of years to over-anticipate Fed interest rate cuts. And this is why, these data releases are really important. I mean, the numbers that we've had yesterday, for instance, the initial claims, the GDP revision, most of that suggests, well, the US economy is in relatively good shape, certainly compared with, Germany's economy, for instance, France, perhaps. And so you do begin to think, is the market pricing in too much? And I think for that reason, the labour data, the employment data next week are really going to be quite crucial. But like I say, that the market does have a tendency to be over-optimistic about interest rate cuts. And there is scope for the Fed to perhaps push back against some of those interest rate expectations over the next few weeks, the next couple of months.
Let's turn to the euro. I've been in the UK the last couple of days, so a lot more in tune with some of the conversations happening around Europe. And the data hasn't been that good. A lot of issues facing the German auto industry. People have started to build in their expectations of the ECB cutting rates this October. But the euro seems to be holding up relatively well. Why do you think that's the case, Jane?
Well, I mean, I would say that in my view, one of the biggest G10 FX stories this year has been the resilience of the euro. We've had a real move towards populism in politics in Europe. We've got Germany's economy, still stagnating. We've got French budget worries, all of these things. And yet the euro has been, or still is, about the second best performing G10 currency in the year today after sterling. So it is resilience. Now, this week, of course, the Chinese stimulus has given the euro some support because China remains, and it has been for a few years now, Germany's biggest export partner. So the anticipation that if China demand is better than expected, well, hopefully that will seep back into Europe, particularly via trade from Germany. So that is a positive development. But, over the next few weeks, I think we're going to find out how fractured the French government is as those budget negotiations push through. And it will be interesting to see whether or not that's a test of the euro's resolve. So there's been plenty of negative factors for the eurozone, or for the euro particularly this year, but it has been resilient as the market tends to focus more on the dollar side of the euro-dollar ratio and concentrating on the amount of Fed easing that we might get.
Yeah, and let's quickly talk about the pound as well, because it is the best performing G10 currency versus the USD. And I wonder to what extent that is a reflection of the Bank of England's relatively more cautious stance when they're thinking about the path of further rate cuts. The market is thinking that the Bank of England will be a little bit more hesitant to go for a quick cutting cycle, perhaps, than other central banks.
I think right now that is a significant part in sterling's resilience, because also in the UK that there is a budget coming up on October the 30th. I think investor confidence that had perhaps been pushed higher a little bit ahead of the UK election in July, and maybe after the UK election in July, is now quite nervous ahead of that budget, because there is talk of a hike in capital gains tax. So there are certain political issues. Perhaps the honeymoon period for the new Labour government is over, and yet sterling is remaining quite resilient. And I think it is because of the cautious approach of the Bank of England, which of course is a function of wage inflation remaining still very robust, services sector inflation remaining robust. So from that point of view, the market's perception that the Bank of England may only cut interest rates once a quarter, slower than perhaps other G10 central banks, is something which is lifting the pound. But I do think that there is some scope for perhaps a little bit more volatility as we approach that budget.
Interesting. Yeah, all eyes on October 30. Jane Foley, thank you so much. Great to speak to you as always. Rabobank, Head of FX Strategy. Now, coming up, Angola's Foreign Affairs Minister hails the relationship with the U.S. ahead of President Joe Biden's visit next month. We hear more from Téte António next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in London. U.S. President Joe Biden is planning to visit Africa next month, fulfilling a promise to visit the continent before he leaves office. Angola Foreign Affairs Minister Téte António spoke with our Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabazaja in New York about the economy and security.
It means it's a very important indicator of the good relationship we have developed with the United States. And second, it is also an encouragement to what we are doing as a country. Our ambition in terms of development, but also in terms of what we are doing to make sure that the environment is stable. Stable, it means in areas of peace and security, things are happening also, as Angola is very well involved in mediation conflict in the neighboring countries, as well as very well concerned and involved in trying to find solutions for some of the concerns we have in issues like terrorism and whatever. You may remember the special summit the African Union held in Malabo on terrorism. Only the vote to terrorism was proposed by Angola. So you can see, but it is a wide range of concerns, but also a wide range of proposals so that solutions can be found.
Has there been progress on those talks in terms of establishing peace between the DRC and Rwanda?
We based on our own experience. We have a country which has gone for 27 years of war. So we have lessons learned, and we are selling the same message, but sending the same message. But peace, there is nothing better than a peace. So definitely we have hope that things are going to be stable in our region. But at some point we'll be all busy only developing our countries and having our people to enjoying what God blessed Africa with, which is abundant resources, 60% of Arab land in the continent, so that we can take care of ourselves.
And Minister, I want to get back to relations because we will see the U.S. President traveling to Angola. You said it does show that relations are stable and they're good. But then what is the purpose of the trip? What are you hoping for? What are you hoping to come out of it following his visit?
Well, strengthening the relations is one of the factors. Second, we also have been working not only at the political level, but the private sector is very well involved as well. It will be encouraged, certainly, the business people and women and men from this country to look at Angola, as well as being a president of the United States. It will attract attention also to Angola.
Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Israel vows to continue its military bombardment of Hezbollah targets in Lebanon indefinitely. Discussions on the U.S.-led ceasefire proposal are continuing. China's benchmark stock index set for its biggest weekly gain since 2008 as officials pledge to increase fiscal support and stabilize the property sector. Plus, partnering up, why PJT chose deNovo for its Middle East expansion. We hear from both of the founders of the firms. Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates, 5:30 a.m. here in the UK. I'm Jumana Versace in London, and markets have notched yet another record high for the S&P, the 42nd record high of the year. So it really tells you something about the strength of these stock markets, despite all of the headwinds that have prevailed so far this year, be they geopolitical or to do with inflation, monetary policy, fiscal policy, you name it. Stock markets don't really care at this point. So S&P futures today not doing much, leaning sideways, but of course coming off those record highs. And looking ahead to that PCE data coming up later today, we spoke about that a while ago. The Fed seems to be placing more emphasis these days anyway on the employment data. So watch out for that. NASDAQ slipping somewhat as we head into the European session, down about 7 basis points. The USD firmer for a change, though the recent trend has been one of weakness. And then Brent, we had a lot of price action to the downside yesterday. The Brent complex is down 4% in the last couple of days. This on report reports that came out. There's one specific FT report that people are pointing to, citing Saudi sources saying that they are thinking about increasing supply and care less about that $100 price level. But that was a report in the FT, and it did actually move markets yesterday. The energy complex was down about 3-4%. And speaking of oil, just to flag very quickly here, one of the terminal charts that caught our eye today, and that is that the managed money net positioning has now turned short on the crude complex. So this is for the first time in a very long time, and actually at a record level of positioning, and tells you that the market has squarely switched away from a rather long positioning towards short. All right, let's check in also how markets in Asia are faring. Yvonne Man is in Hong Kong, and it has been quite the week for many of these Chinese indices. Just walk us through the price action today, Yvonne.
Yeah, Jemana, it's been a historic week when it comes to markets here in China. You take a look at what's been going on. There's a sense of this FOMO trade that's going on right now, that people just need to chase this rally, at least in the short term. You take a look at what we saw in the Politburo meeting last night, and that readout was shorter than usual, but the fact that is it showed urgency, right, saying they want to stop the decline in the property market. They're vowing for more fiscal measures and more forceful fiscal measures. That was enough for us to add another 10% in the last 3 days in this session here. And take a look at how these benchmarks are doing here right now. The Hang Seng is back above 20,000. We're seeing gains of 3.5%. We are on track for that benchmark. The best week since 1998 brings us back to the Asian financial crisis. And we're talking very closely when it comes to Shanghai Composite, well above that 3,000 level. And here's one thing, the Chinex, this is the Shenzhen the tech-heavy sort of benchmark there. Best day on record. We're seeing surging some 8 or 9% here right now. The CSI 300, you mentioned that milestone when it comes to the best week since 2008. So we're talking about 16 years, one of the best days we've seen for the onshore market. You pair that with the turnover, right? So the last 2 days, we saw 1 trillion renminbi of turnover in this market. And it looks like right now we're on track for possibly a third day, because today alone, the first hour, we saw about 710 billion renminbi in trading. That's why we're seeing some glitches and that in this market right now. So expect to see a bit more volatility here moving forward. And if you add it all up, $1.4 trillion in market cap added over this week alone when it comes to China equities as well. Yeah. In terms of movers, it's really a different sentiment. It used to be anything but China. Now it's all in by China. And what are they buying? It's the consumption stocks. It's the property stocks. These are the two sectors that really lag behind in this market. So you're seeing it really tilt to more away from the defensive, more to more of these maybe cyclical factors as well. So you take a look at how beer makers are doing, dairy producers are doing, property developers are doing very, very well here today too.
It certainly does feel like a super pivotal week for these Chinese equity indices. The question I have always is to what degree the stock market outperformance is going to be reflected in the real economy, which is what the authorities are trying to shore up here. Yvonne, thank you so much. It's always great to have you on our show. Yvonne Man in Hong Kong. But more now on the crisis in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has arrived in New York and is vowing to keep hitting Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Lebanese authorities say the bombardment has displaced 500,000 people, piling more pressure on a strained economy. The Lebanese Economy and Trade Minister Amin Salam told us his government has been working on contingency plans for over a year.
Lebanon is a big importing country, and we have seen those challenges coming, particularly after the war between Ukraine and Russia that affected our food security in a major way. So we are at a decent place today where we have stocks that can last for 4 to 5 months of everything. However, our concern is only not to have any of our, ports or airports affected, because that will affect the trade cycle, and then we cannot bring in additional stocks. But so far, we have coverage for about, between 4 to 6 months of food and other products that are needed by the people.
For more, let's bring in Laila Al Amine, Lebanon Country Director at Mercy Corps. Laila, just taking into consideration everything that has happened over the last week, we talk about, the foreign minister has mentioned hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people, rising death toll, thousands of people injured over the course of the last 7 days or so. How do you view the situation on the ground right now in Lebanon from a humanitarian perspective?
Hi, Jumana. Thank you for the time. The situation is really hell right now on the ground. We have families who have been fleeing their villages by feet. They don't know where to sleep. It's true that the government has been preparing this contingency plan. And as the minister said just before, there is a stock of food, but this food is not reaching people. People are completely desperate. We have 500,000 people on the road. They are sleeping on roundabout. Some of them are sleeping in their cars. They've been looking for a place where to sleep for several days. Some of them are in areas where there is still daily bombing. So even humanitarian workers cannot reach them. They lack everything: food, basic hygiene items, water. So the situation right now is really still very dire.
Where does the solution come from? Is it the government providing additional support to those who need it, or is this a space for NGOs to step in?
I believe it has to be a collaboration between both, right? For example, the government has opened all the schools in the country to welcome the displaced people, but there is not enough funding to actually support them at the moment. So there is definitely a space for the international community to step in, and there is a need to increase the funding. The UN have estimated that we need at least 48 million immediately right now to support the displaced population, and about 123 million for the coming months. So there is a big funding gap, and this is a challenge at the moment. And after 4 years of economic crisis, plus 1 year of conflict, because it started already a year ago, both the government and the population of Lebanon have depleted all their assets, and there are no savings to support people who have been fleeing the conflict right now.
Yeah. The economy minister told me yesterday that the government has provided for enough rations for the next 4 to 6 months. Does that tally up with what you're seeing and what you're hearing on the ground?
So there is enough food. There is definitely enough food in the market in Lebanon. It doesn't mean that people have access to it. So people who are in shelters have received food mostly from local civil society organizations, from international NGOs. But what has been provided by the government has been extremely little.
What do you think would be the best case scenario right now? And obviously from a political standpoint, we've been talking about the potential for a temporary ceasefire. That still would be a temporary ceasefire. Even if that does get enacted, do you foresee the internally displaced people in Lebanon going back to their homes?
Well, we're all hoping for a ceasefire. Yesterday, we were very hopeful about it. Unfortunately, a ceasefire is not enough. What we want is a total halt of hostilities. There needs to be a diplomatic solution, of course. I mean, there is no military solution to this conflict. And then what we know is that over 95% of the villages in the southern border are completely destroyed. So actually, people cannot go back. We have already over 20 water facilities that have been destroyed. They have lost all their assets, the agricultural fields, all their means of livelihood. So actually, the figures I shared earlier are just for humanitarian assistance, but what we need is much more for early recovery, to rebuild the houses, to restart the economy in the south. And this is only under these conditions that people can go back.
Do you see any ramifications on the social construct in Lebanon and the fact that there are so many people displaced in the country, showing up in areas that are not equipped to deal with the influx of internally displaced people? Are we going to see ramifications on the social fabric of Lebanese of the Lebanese population now, simply because the system is not equipped to deal with the internal displacement that has taken place?
Definitely, that's a huge burden for the economy and for the Lebanese society. What we have seen in the first months is that people were moving, but were remaining as close as possible to their villages. So they were often hosted by families from the same community who were showing solidarity. But now people have been fleeing very far because the hostilities have been so violent this week. We're talking over 500 casualties in one day alone on Monday. And therefore, people have been fleeing very far from their place of origin, and it has increased tensions between the community. If you add to this several layers, because we have Palestinian refugees, we have Syrian refugees in Lebanon, so it creates even more tension between the different communities. And this is why it's important to ensure that the aid reaches everyone, and it's based on vulnerability of people and not on their status.
Yeah, absolutely. Laila, thank you very much for joining us today. Laila Al Amine, Lebanon Country Director at Mercy Corps.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, a Wall Street advisory firm, PJT, has Saudi ambitions after its acquisition of Dubai's deNovo Partners. We hear from the founders of both firms next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in London. Wall Street advisory PJT Partners is expanding into the Middle East with its acquisition of Dubai's deNovo Partners. Now, I spoke with the founders of both firms as they toured Dubai.
Well, everything we've done has been with the view towards great aspiration but patience. And always we're being patient about finding the right partners, the right colleagues, the right individuals who share our vision, our values. And we've had the great fortune of working with May for literally decades. She and I worked together for many years at Morgan Stanley. She and our senior leadership team know each other very well. 4.5 years ago, we started a strategic alliance that gave us an opportunity to start small and to take step after step and to build relationships, client engagement, and it's been a smashing success. So after 4.5 years, I think we collectively agreed it was the right time to formally join forces and be one firm.
May, let me go to you now. From your perspective, why did this make sense for deNovo? And again, should we expect perhaps any change in the way you think about dealing with some of the senior relationships or clients that you have in the region now?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jumana, for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. As Paul said, this was a long time in the making. I have known the PJT leadership team and Paul for many, many years and had the privilege of working with them. And so for me, it was a little bit of a homecoming to think about combining our forces. As we take a bit of a step back, deNovo, over the past 14 years, has built itself as a trusted advisor in the region, has done multitude transactions, has a core group of clients, an ever-growing group of clients with a phenomenal team that has built that client trust over the decades that we've been operating as well. And for us, it was a natural next step to integrate into PJT, an organization who we know well, senior leadership who we have a lot of trust and a history with. And as we look at our region and where our region is going, and in particular where our clients and where our clients' ambitions are, it made sense for us to globalize our offering. We do a lot here, we've done a lot regionally, we've done a lot cross-border, but with a multitude of the skill set, expertise, track record, and just sheer industry depth and connectivity that PJT has, the combination made absolute sense. It was a natural progression, and for us, it just allows us to help service our clients a lot better.
And May, could you give us some visibility perhaps on whether there's going to be specific target sectors or target client groups that will change on the back of this acquisition, or is it going to be business as usual but just under the PJT umbrella?
I mean, I think you can call it an enhanced business as usual. So we are certainly looking forward towards servicing a lot of the sovereign wealth funds and the multinationals that exist over here, the regional government-owned organizations, some of the corporates that have become really quite large and looking at growth beyond just the region as well. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily at all business as usual. I think I would say it's a torpedoed business, which has a lot more engine behind it. If I look at the multitude of the people that sit within the PJT family, they have 110 partners that give us a lot of industry and product depth and skill sets that enhances what it is we're looking to do. So I suppose what it means is that we are, as an organization, able to become now a global leader in what it is that we're doing, not just a regional leader, and try to continue the service of all the offerings that we have for our clients as their ambitions grow and globalize, we globalize with them.
Paul, when we think about the Middle East landscape relative to some of the other geographies that you operate in, it is still quite nascent. To what extent does that actually open up opportunities for you?
Well, we've always been attracted to the clientele, the capital flows, and the trajectory in the region. And for us, it was never an issue of if, but when we would be part of this market in an all-on way. But we were only prepared to do it with the right partner, the right team, and there was a lot of other build-out that we needed to do elsewhere around the globe. So for the first 9 years, we've been spending our time building capabilities, a suite of advisory capabilities, client relationships, industry expertise, and as we've continued to build that out, there was always the understanding that this region is integral to being a best-in-class global firm. But in order to do that, you need best-in-class individuals, and with deNovo, with May, with the team, we have that. So one step at a time, and there's no doubt that this is a particularly fortuitous time to be investing in the region, but our decision was made based on now being the right time to pick the right partner.
Yeah. And I know that Dubai is going to be PJT's headquarters in the region, but earlier on in the year, deNovo got a license to operate in Saudi Arabia. Should we expect some personnel to be based in Riyadh as well?
Absolutely. I think that will follow that license, and we will, in a very patient way, continue to build out our capabilities. But the first imperative is to make sure that we have a seamless integration between the two firms. We feel very comfortable because of the 4.5 years that we've been operating as strategic partners, and then we intend to go from strength to strength and to continue to invest and to continue to build out our capabilities and better serve clients around the globe and here in the Gulf.
Paul Taubman, founder and CEO of PJT Partners, and May Nasrallah, founder and executive chair of deNovo Partners. Well, coming up, the Gulf Coalition is calling on Israel and Hezbollah to de-escalate. Up next, a senior UAE presidential advisor tells us why the push for a ceasefire is critical. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersecci in London. A diplomatic advisor to the UAE president says the history of the Middle East shows that once war breaks out in the region, it's not easy to disengage. Anwar Gargash spoke to Bloomberg in New York as the UAE joined calls for a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah.
We're in a very comfortable place. The relationship is institutional. It's not a polarizing relationship. And from that perspective, for us, consistency of U.S. foreign policy, the idea that we add to this relationship, we're a trusted partner. Mm-hmm. So for us, I think this is completely a domestic American issue. I think we can, sort of have that institutional relationship with the United States, whether we see a Democratic president or we see a Republican president.
The conflict between Israel and Lebanon rises every day. I hear the word de-escalation. Every day I report on it. Today, you, along with other Gulf nations, the Gulf Coalition, have urged for a ceasefire. You have a very different relationship with with Israel. You have normalized relations. Are the Israelis listening to you more than the others in this privileged position that you have?
Well, again, first of all, our statement today includes 11 other countries. Some are Arab countries, some are European countries, and of course, the United States is included. We're very, very worried about the escalation in Lebanon. This is a country that is long suffering. This is a country where we have seen economic meltdown, where we have seen a large pool of talented people leave the country. And the last thing I think that we want to see for Lebanon is really a humanitarian catastrophe and more escalation. The history in the region also tells us that once you embark on a war footing, events take a certain hold on you, and it is not easy to disengage. So it's extremely important that the deal for a ceasefire works. We are, very thankful for the efforts of the United States and for France in this. We do really need to see a ceasefire in Lebanon.
All these efforts are to avoid a ground invasion. Can that be avoided? How optimistic are you that can be avoided?
Well, again, the efforts are to avoid that. The efforts are also to avoid further human suffering. The efforts are to allow many of the civilian population in northern Israel and southern Lebanon to return, and the bigger picture also to avoid something that we've all been worried about collectively as the international community, which is an expanding war.
Excellent to hear the perspective of Anwar Gargash, diplomatic advisor to the UAE President. And of course, MBZ has been in the US this week, meeting with President Biden, and also had a side meeting with former President Trump as well. But thank you for staying with us for all of this week. That was Horizon's Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in London, back in Dubai on Monday.